Hello, my name is Dan Holme. I'm an Office 365 MVP and the co-founder of IT Unity. Recently, Microsoft announced that Office 365 channels are now available on IFT, also known as If This, Then That. So this is a great time to learn what IFT is and what it can do to make your professional and even personal lives more productive. While this video is going to be fairly self-contained, I do recommend that you watch my earlier video, What are Web Services and Why Do They Matter, as a prerequisite. It will really help you understand what IFT is doing behind the scenes. You can get to that video from http://itunity.com/danholme. So what exactly is IFT? IFT, also known as If This, Then That, allows you to connect two cloud services. You watch one service, and when something happens, then you do something in another service. It creates a bridge between the two services, like a one-step workflow, to make something happen that either service could not do on its own. To learn more about this, let's use an example of Microsoft Office 365's Contacts service and its Mail service. Now, each of these services are exposed, so there are connections that allow a developer to read and write contacts, and that allow developers to read and write email. Now we're going to put these two services together to solve a problem I have. When I meet someone new and I add them to my contacts, I want to be sure immediately to send them an email saying, "It was nice to meet you, and here's my contact information." I can state that problem as an if this, then that statement. Specifically, if I add a contact, then send an email automatically with my contact information. That becomes our if this, then that statement. And before we go and build this, we need to understand some terminology that if this, then that uses. First, there are the two services, contacts and mail. In if terminology, those are channels. So we have an Outlook 365 an Office 365 contacts channel and an Office 365 email channel. What we're watching for is in the contacts channel if a new contact is added. That is called the trigger. So the if side of the statement is watching for a trigger. If that trigger occurs, we then do something. We send an email. That do is an action. The whole thing put together, if I add a contact, then send email, is called a recipe by IFT. And within the recipe, we'll also see ingredients when we dive down a little bit deeper. So these are the terms you need to know in order to successfully start using if this, then that. So let's start our exploration of if this, then that recipes. Simply go to IFT.com and create an account. It's free. And the good news is there's lots of recipes that already exist. You don't even have to know how to create many recipes. Click Browse and search. If I search for Office 365 contacts, for example, I will see several recipes that have already been created by other users. In fact, Microsoft has created some recipes. Here's a recipe that, when I add a new contact, creates a card in Trello. And when you go to browse for recipes after watching this video, you will actually find the very recipe we're going to create in this video. So before you create a recipe, check to see if a recipe already exists. If it does, you can use it. And if it's close but not exactly what you want, you can modify it to create a new recipe for yourself. So what if you do want to create a new recipe? If you want to create a new recipe, you're simply going to define if this, then that. From the IFT homepage, click My Recipes. And from the My Recipes page, click Create a Recipe. IFT then prompts you to complete the statement if this, then that. We start by defining what this is. And in our case, it's watching for a new contact being added to Office 365. So when I click this, I'm asked what the channel is that we are going to use as the trigger. In this case, it's Office 365 contacts. So I scroll down, I find Office 365 contacts, and click. And if this is the first time you've used that channel in a recipe, the first time ever, you'll be prompted to authenticate to log on to that channel and give IFT permission to use that channel. Then we're prompted to choose a trigger. And this is what it is we're looking for. In our case, we're looking to watch for a new contact being added. Now, some triggers will require additional information to be populated, but in this case, we're just looking for a new contact, so we can click Create Trigger. We've now defined the if side of the statement. If in Office 365 contacts, a new contact is added, then, and now we're being prompted for the that side of the statement. I click that, and once again am prompted to pick a channel. This time, however, we're looking for the channel where we are going to perform an action, and the channel's Office 365 Mail. Now, to save myself some time scrolling, I'm just going to go ahead and browse for the channel and click it. And again, if this were the first time I was using this channel, I would have been prompted to log on and give IFT permission to the channel. The channel exposes what actions we can do with the channel, and in this case, the only action available is to send an email. Luckily, that's exactly what I want. And then we're prompted to populate the details about the action. Now, the details are obviously going to depend on what action you're performing. In this case, we're sending an email, so we're going to need to be able to define the recipients, the subject line, and the body. As a recipient, I want to send this not to a specific person, but to the person whose contact I just added. It's like a variable. Notice the beaker at the end of the recipients box. This allows me to add ingredients. I'm given a list of ingredients to pick from, and I pick email address. Now notice what's happening here is the ingredients list are simply the properties of a contact in Office 365 contacts. I could pick first name, last name, company name, phone, or email address. And I add that as an ingredient, and notice how the ingredient is displayed with two curly braces. But when I click in the next line, subject, that ingredient turns into a gray button, like email address. It's still the same ingredient, it's just a matter of me being in the recipient's box or outside the recipient's box. Now in the subject line, I want to put a greeting to the person who I just added. So I'm going to say greetings, and I want to use their first name. Again, first name is going to be an ingredient. So I click the beaker and choose first name as the ingredient. Once again, the ingredient is added with two curly braces. Now in the body of the email, I'm going to put my message. So my message is going to be, it was a pleasure to meet you. Here's my contact information. And when I'm finished, I click Create Action. We're now at step 7, where we give this recipe a title. When I'm all finished, I click Create Recipe, and then I'm notified that the recipe is created, and the recipe appears at the top of my recipes list. So you can see that IFT steps you through the process of creating a new recipe by asking you to define the trigger and the action. Now, if you decide to change the recipe later, you can. Next to the recipe on the recipes page, there's a little pencil icon. I can click that to edit the recipe, and I can change some of the details of the recipe I've created. Notice from here I can also delete the recipe, check its log, or run the recipe manually, or publish the recipe, and all of these are things we'll talk about more in just a moment. Some of these commands are also visible on the recipe page itself, so I can get to the log and I can check the recipe and turn it off and on straight from the recipes page. Now let's put this recipe to test. I'm going to add a new contact in Office 365 and click Save. Now after a period of time, the IFT recipe will run. We can see that we created this recipe recently and then it hasn't been run yet, and IFT recipes run on a schedule. IFT doesn't publish how frequently each type of recipe runs, but my experience has been they generally run within 5 or 15 minutes. So it will run automatically, but if we are a little impatient or if we're wanting to test this recipe, in our case, we can click Check Recipe. And IFT will run the recipe now. We're notified that the recipe was checked, and if we go to the log of the recipe, we'll see that the recipe was in fact triggered. It detected that there was a new contact. So we should in fact see that an email was sent from me to John Doe. And if I jump into my Office 365 Sent Items folder, we do see in fact that an email went from me to John Doe with my message to John. It worked perfectly. So we've now seen how to browse for recipes, create new recipes, edit recipes, check recipes manually, and monitor the recipe by looking at its log. The last step is to share our knowledge. This is a community that IFTTT has created, and it's recommended that if you've created a recipe that might be valuable to others, you should publish the recipe. Click Edit Recipe, and then click Publish. When you publish a recipe, you're given the opportunity to create a different title than the title you're using for yourself. And we can put some notes in the recipe. Now, I'm actually going to put some notes in here in a moment after we scroll down a little further to see what the action of this recipe is going to be. Now, you'll notice in the action, there are some flags that will hide certain fields. This is designed to protect you from accidentally publishing personal information. So, for example, the subject field is currently being hidden. But in our case, there's no personal information in that. And if we want to give people who use our recipe a head start, we might go ahead and enable the subject field. So greetings first name is the default subject field for someone who uses our recipe. Now they can of course change it, but at least that gives them a head start. Same thing with the body of the message. We might go ahead and enable the body, but simply manually delete any of the personal contact information in that field. Now interestingly, with this recipe, it is completely blanking out recipients. And it's telling us that each user of the recipe will have to fill this out. In our recipe, that's kind of unfortunate because we had the right variable in there. It would be nice if the recipe included that, but it doesn't. So I'm going to include that as a note to the recipe. I'm going to include some instructions to people who use my recipe that they need to add the email address ingredient to the recipients field, and they need to add their contact information to body. We're all finished, and we're going to publish this recipe now. Here's our published recipe. So now, when you log on to IFTTT and you do a search for recipes involving Office 365 contacts, you'll find the recipe we just created. You can click the recipe, and then add it to your IFTTT service. That's what IFTTT is all about. Creating recipes, sharing recipes with the community, and using those recipes or extending them to be the perfect recipe for you. Hopefully you've enjoyed this introduction to IFTTT and this first recipe that allows you to send a greeting email to a new contact. If you're looking for more of my videos and solutions, you can find me at itunity.com/Dan Holme. Happy cooking with IFTTT!